Good afternoon, and welcome to the third session of the Federal Reserve's Systems New Community Development Research Seminar Series. I'm Matushka Lindo-Briggs, Director of Special Projects and Strategic Support for the Community Development Department at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. The Federal Reserve Community Development Research Seminar Series is a forum of exploring the intersection of research, policy, and practice in the community development field. The series expands access to high-quality research that informs stakeholders who are working to support low and moderate income communities and communities of color. In August, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors presented a research seminar focused on issues related to the employment experiences of low-income workers during the pandemic and how to improve the financial security of these workers. In October, the Federal Reserve Banks of Dallas and Kansas City built on that conversation by exploring issues related to women's economic declines during COVID-19 and the ability of women to participate in the labor market post-pandemic. In our final session of 2021, the Federal Reserve Banks of Atlanta and Philadelphia, along with a group of esteemed researchers joining us today, will examine what we've learned from the administration of emergency rental relief and evaluate universal vouchers as a long-term solution for increasing housing security among renters. Before turning the event over to Peggy Bailey of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, I'll run through some housekeeping for our webinar. First, our legal notice and disclaimer. The opinions and statements expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and are intended only for informational purposes. They do not reflect official positions of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis or the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. If you haven't joined us through the webinar yet, go ahead and click the link you received after registering. For the best webinar experience, please use the Chrome or Microsoft Edge browser. We also have provided an FAQ document which can be found using the Materials button on the webinar player page. I'll highlight a few more important notes for you. So for the best webinar experience, we recommend you use the web stream to consume this live video event through your computer speakers. If you have technical issues, you are welcome to dial into the phone number posted on the player page. Just the video may not sync perfectly with the phone audio. We will be taking questions from our audience in two ways today. Please submit them using the Ask Question button or email them to communities@stls.frb.org. Please note that all event materials and a recording will be available on fedcommunities.org following this event. I'd now like to formally introduce Peggy Bailey of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Peggy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matushka, and thank you to the Federal Reserve Banks of St. Louis and Philadelphia for having me here today and hosting this discussion. Addressing the rising costs of rent is essential to help low and moderate income families benefit from the growing economy. Rent is typically a family's highest household expense, and this would be true if families spent only the recommended 30% of their income on rent. But far too many families pay way more than that. According to 2019 data analyzed by the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, about 11 million renter households use 50% or more of their income for rent. The pandemic has put this in sharp focus. The sudden loss of income and lack of savings for so many families caused them to fall behind on rent almost immediately. The federal response was to ultimately dedicate over $46 billion in emergency rental assistance. But imagine if we had already had a universal rental assistance program that worked like Medicaid so that all eligible people received assistance and received a basic benefit. And eligibility could be determined almost immediately anytime there's a crisis. There would have been an increase in spending, definitely. And typically during an economic crisis, Medicaid expenses are increased. But but it wouldn't have been $46 billion, and many fewer families would have fallen behind on their rent. But we don't have a universal program, so how do we get one? And if the approach is incremental, what are the right steps to take? And what have we learned from the emergency rental assistance program? Those are all things that you should be looking forward to learning and hearing about and asking questions about for the panels to come. Anytime though the idea of increasing rental assistance comes up, there are some narratives that we have to overcome, and I want to share those so that we can explicitly start to talk about them more, because we need to be able to address them directly. So one of the things that we hear a lot is that rent just goes to greedy landlords. And so why should we have to pay rent in the first place? But often, even proponents of more rental assistance use this and think of rent as purely a profit for landlords and not as the means by which operating and maintenance costs are paid, or as the main or significant income source for many smaller landlords who are in effect small business owners. The second thing we hear often is that people don't work hard enough, and if they just worked harder, they would make more and be able to afford the rent. This forgets that we don't live in a meritocracy, and people can work very hard and not make enough to afford a place to live without assistance. Over the last 20 years, incomes have stayed relatively stagnant, but rent has increased by 13%. And this is, again, based on pre-pandemic data and doesn't account for the major increases we know are happening at this moment in time. Rent assistance should be thought of like Medicaid is now, since the Affordable Care Act passed, a necessary expense to help families who don't make enough to pay their rent. And we really need to think about this really as people who we don't pay enough, and not put it on families, because so often they're working very hard. They're just not paid enough money to afford their entire rent. A third piece that we hear a lot is that there's not enough housing supply, and there are definitely places where supply is an issue and that this is the case, but it isn't entirely a problem that we can build our way out of. Think about it. We're not solving solely for homelessness. Many people have a good place to live. They just struggle to be able to afford it. So having additional rental assistance can help many people just stay housed and be able to afford more of the basic needs that they need to make to get by. A fourth thing that we hear a lot is increasing the availability of rental assistance will make rent costs rise, because landlords will know they can charge more because people now have assistance. And while this is an area that needs more study, and it's something to ask about during the presentation, there's little evidence that shows that this is the likely income. And even if costs go up a little, it far outweighs the benefits of addressing this problem. And we know, as I said before, rental costs are increasing exponentially. The last thing I want to mention is that we often hear that people can't use vouchers now, and now there's not even enough. So it would be a waste to provide more because so many will go unused. And yes, there are reasons families find it difficult to use their rental assistance and use vouchers, but this is a problem with solutions. Many housing authorities and communities are experimenting with anti-source of income discrimination efforts, landlord incentives that draw more landlords into the program. We as the administration are investing in additional administrative fees for PHAs, understanding they need the resources to be able to help families find places to live. And all of these things have been proven ways to help with voucher utilization and things that we can lean into to solve this problem, not use it as an excuse not to invest in families. So I can't be more excited that the housing community, that now we're taking seriously the chance to not only prevent evictions, but greatly expand rental assistance. Just think about a few years ago, we would have laughed at the idea that we might be moving to the day where we have universal assistance. And now universal assistance and eviction prevention are centerpieces of President Biden's Build Back Better agenda. So simply And the reason that we call it the Build Back Better agenda is that simply going back to the way things were pre-pandemic isn't acceptable. It will leave too many families behind and won't prepare us for the next economic crisis. So thank you again to the Federal Reserve for hosting this discussion, and I hope it continues so that the drumbeat on the importance of rental assistance gets stronger and stronger, leading to the day when everyone who needs rental assistance gets it. And Matushka, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Peggy. I would now like to turn it over to our first panel, which will reflect on what we've learned from the administration of emergency rental relief during the COVID-19 pandemic. We will hear two research presentations, one from Elora Raymond of the Georgia Institute of Technology and one from Rebecca Ye of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Following each presentation, you will hear from Elizabeth Strom of the University of South Florida and Giselle Ruthier of NYU Langone Health, who will respond to Elora and Rebecca's research respectively. These responses will help connect key research insights to policy and practice. I would now like to introduce Elora Raymond. Elora, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. Again, my name is Ewrap. I'm an assistant professor at the School of City and Regional Planning at Georgia Tech. And I'm here today to talk about preliminary research findings from two studies that are going on concurrently. The first is a Russell Sage Foundation funded study into preserving rental housing stability during disasters. And we're conducting interviews with courts and landlords and collecting evictions data in order to understand eviction prevention during the crisis. And another project in which we are trying to stand up an evictions data tool in a participatory fashion and working alongside legal aid and community and tenant organizations, again, looking to prevent evictions during this crisis. And so from these two research projects, we have preliminary data that gives us some insight into what some of the key barriers are to dispersing Ewrap funds during this crisis. So a little bit about the Georgia context. We have very high housing instability. The most recent household health survey had Georgia having the highest likelihood of having to leave, households having to leave their home in the next 2 months due to eviction. We also have a long history of unspent federal dollars, and this is reflected when we look at the current Ewrap distribution. The other aspect I think that's really important to think about in terms of Georgia is that this is a state with very few legal protections for tenants. So to the extent that we're observing courts trying to work hand in hand with other providers, there are just fewer legal protections that these courts have to hand, to work with tenants. And often we hear judges say things like, well, if the rent isn't paid, there's not a whole lot of tools that I have in order to stop an eviction. You can also see here, this chart shows the monthly eviction filing numbers for several counties. The first 5 are from the metro Atlanta area, and others are from Macon and Savannah, so smaller cities within the state. And what we see is that there really was never an effective stop to evictions. We had a brief judicial state of emergency. There was no eviction moratoria in Georgia. And, for the last year, we've been having, in different counties, thousands of evictions filed every month. And the other thing I'd note about the eviction process is that we have a very short eviction process. So it's not uncommon. We have no notice period. It's not uncommon for an eviction filing to happen, and then, the following week, the landlord can start to apply for a writ if the tenant doesn't answer. And the other thing is that our urban courts, because we have such a high eviction rate and because the process is so fast, they're high-volume institutions. So they're structured a little bit differently than courts that are used to handling many fewer cases. So what does this mean for Ewrap delivery? Despite the high levels of housing insecurity, despite the very high eviction rate that we've been observing all throughout, we see that Ewrap delivery has fallen far short, and our state average is for the first phase is 18%. And this is in large part driven by the fact that the state entity has 77% of all funds, but as of September 30th, only spent 8.5% of the funds. So we see that there are some local counties and cities that have been effective in dispersing these funds, but that there's a lot of variation. So I can talk specifically about the types of procedural problems that we've seen, but what I want to comment on more broadly is what are the characteristics of the institutions that are effectively distributing the same, with the characteristics of the institutions that have been slow to deliver funds. So the characteristics of entities that ramped up Ewrap expenditures, and I'd say that across the board that this program was a little slow to start in Georgia, and in those first months we didn't see a lot of tenants help, but there are some places that have really ramped up and others that haven't. And what we see from our interviews is that when we're talking to judges, we see people separating the social problems from the legal process and not thinking of their court solely as a legal entity, but thinking of landlords and tenants as having problems that they need to solve and trying to think about whether eviction is the answer. And if it isn't, coordinating with Ewrap programs or coordinating with CARES Act funding sources and other legal aid providers around the problem of unpaid rent. They're also coordinating around tenant outreach. So as I mentioned, Georgia doesn't have a notification period in this extremely short window, sometimes just a week after an eviction is filed, in which you might be able to make a difference. So the focus has turned in the courts and outside the courts towards pre-eviction outreach. So places that had eviction diversion programs have been able to convert these to centers that are delivering rental assistance. The effectiveness of pre-eviction outreach is enhanced when you have a community organization that has established outreach capacity, and that partnership has been evident in the success of many programs. And we also see that these entities have transparency around their process and their spending. They're also in conversation with community organizations and tenant advocates. And so this leads to an iterative improvement cycle where you're talking to entities that are on a first name basis with the county commissioner or with their local legal aid folks. You see different outcomes than when you sort of hear these conversations and there's we meet every 2 months or so, or there's a group that's formed, but it's not somebody that I pick up the phone and talk with once a week. So that sort of relationship makes a big difference. What are the characteristics of entities with persistently low Ewrap expenditures where there just hasn't been any ramp up? They're not meeting their targets. In these entities, we see that the top priority is creating an audit-proof process, and the top priority is on fraud prevention. And by fraud and audit-proof, I mean they're really concerned about tenants who might have some kind of fraudulent application. And when this is the top priority at these entities, this prioritization is associated with very defensively designed application processes that are, of course, extremely slow and cumbersome and difficult for landlords and tenants to complete. We see a reluctance to outsource distribution to community partners who might be very effective at outreach because there's a worry about letting control go. So allowing a community partner to control that process becomes a concern. There's a reluctance to share data or discuss policy. So sometimes it's even difficult to uncover what is the tenant application process. What does self-attestation mean? There's just a reluctance to be transparent about the process and about the efficacy, again, out of this concern about being audited and fraud. And the other thing I mentioned is that potential fraud, not unspent funds, is perceived as leading to charges of mismanagement, ineptitude, or incompetence. So in the past, Georgia entities have been audited and have been found to have done all of these things in managing federal funds. But that's not the fear, despite that legacy. Again, the fear is focused on preventing a tenant from filing a fraudulent claim. And I'd also add that on the court side, there's been discussion in Georgia about using the courts as a source of outreach or as a source of information, and that's worked in some places better than others. Where it doesn't work, we see that the courts are concerned about providing what might constitute legal advice. And so I'm not going to comment on that, whether or not that's a valid legal concern or not. I think certainly my co-authors feel that it's not, but that is the expressed concern. So what are the policy recommendations for a situation like this? I feel like at this point, there's been a lot of great advice about how to structure an effective Ewrap program. And what I wanted to just point out here were some of the institutional factors. I would say that in states like Georgia, where we haven't had a strong we haven't had an eviction moratorium, we haven't had a strong state response. The effective Ewrap programs are being designed and delivered by networks of organizations at the local level. And so when we think about the federal government communicating and giving guidance, to the extent that those communications can be public and transparent, they're going to be reaching the local networks of organizations that are delivering and are helping to craft policy. And when they're kept private, they're less useful, I think, is one of the findings. We also say that underperforming states like Georgia have extremely high levels of housing distress. I think for this audience, it's probably well understood, but it's not because of a lack of need that we don't see these funds being dispersed. It's for other reasons. And so we agree with others in saying that we prefer that funding be reallocated within the state to entities that have proved effective. And then also I think it's important to explore incentives that would motivate entities that are primarily concerned about audits and fraud prevention of the sort where, of the tenant application sort, and where they're not really worried about unspent funds, and that's a lesser priority, because in that case, the motivations might not work as expected. So thinking about the priorities of the institutions that are responsible and about designing policies that will work for them. Thanks very much. I look forward to the rest of the panel, and I'm going to turn this back to Matushka.
Thank you, Laura, for that presentation. So now here with the response to this presentation is Elizabeth Strom. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me, and I enjoyed Laura's presentation. In some ways, I feel like I can be very brief about this because I can just say, yeah, what she said. I've been working with colleagues at the University of Miami Medical School and the Community Justice Project in Miami to explore some similar issues, and so I thought I would comment on some of Laura's points with regards to Florida, but really everything she said is applicable to Florida as well. Now, our research was first motivated before Ewrap was created, and so we had focused a lot on differences with eviction moratoria, so I'm going to start by talking about that just a bit. Florida did have a state moratorium. We also had a local moratorium in Miami-Dade County. And so there are some other factors to consider, in addition to, of course, the CDC moratorium, which was applied across the state and the nation starting in October 2020. And so I think although these moratoria had limitations, they definitely bought some time for some people until they could access returning to work or emergency rental funds. So if you go to slide 2, I want to use our current eviction data to show you some of the impact you might see from moratoria. And the ramp-up of rental aid. And so the eviction data on this slide are from the Tampa area, Hillsborough County, over nearly the past 3 years. I've included 2019 filings, which is the blue line. That kind of shows you what, if you will, normal looks like in our area. That's about 1,000 filings a month. That's pretty sad. That's normal. The red line is the year 2020, so you can see the dramatic drop in April. So that is when Governor DeSantis imposed an eviction moratorium that was pretty comprehensive. Now, filings picked up a bit after July. The governor had narrowed the scope of the moratorium, and then the CDC moratorium kicked in October, although obviously that did not halt eviction filings altogether. The gray line is 2021. Obviously, we have no data for October, November, and December, but I would argue this is sort of interesting because, if anything, the CDC moratorium was becoming less effective over time. But when you look at the summer months in Hillsborough County, you see filings sort of dropping and plateauing. And I can't prove that yet with these data, but I'd like to think that this is a sign of Ewrap dollars coming in and forestalling some eviction filings. Now, if you go to slide 3, you'll see some similar numbers for Miami-Dade County. My colleagues at the Community Justice Project created this visual so you can see the changes associated with different moratorium milestones. So we note again the so-called normal eviction filings in early 2020, and then the impact of various moratoria with the light purple representing the state moratorium and blue the somewhat less effective CDC moratorium. Now these data were tracked weekly, not monthly. So there's more up and down that you see in the image, but still I would argue that you see some impact of rental assistance programs kicking in because the filings do not spike with the end of the CDC moratorium, which had been the fear of many people. Now, if you go to slide 4, this is where we get some insight into the last part of the eviction process. When a landlord files an eviction, which we tracked in the first few tables, it starts a process that may end with the sheriff or police physically evicting a household. This is what we call the execution of the writ. So here are data for Dade County. The light red is indicating when writs of possession were issued by the courts. So you can see that they stopped issuing this final step of eviction between April and June 2020. In July, Miami-Dade did allow some evictions to move forward, but only those filed prior to March, I think, 13th, 2020. So in other words, the older evictions pre-pandemic, they allowed those to move forward. But they still did not allow the police to evict people who had gotten eviction filings post-pandemic or during the pandemic. The local moratorium on the last stage of evictions ended completely in March 2021, and you see those dark red lines indicating where the police are sort of playing catch-up on those old writs that had been waiting. But still, there were a number of months when evictions were not completed in Dade County, thanks to local intervention. By way of comparison, many other Florida counties restarted executing these writs and evicting people as far back as May 2020. The counties in the Tampa Bay area in the summer of 2020. So you can see where local action has a real impact because Miami-Dade made this decision to stop the final stage of eviction. Now, if we move to slide 5, that brings us back to the question of emergency rental aid. Once emergency rental aid kicked in, then thanks to the moratorium, there were people who could take advantage of it. And I want to first show you the very much like Alora's observations in Georgia, that we see that local governments have done a lot better job of rolling out their programs than the state government did theirs. The state program called Our Florida has spent just under a quarter of its allocation, while local programs collectively have spent almost 60% with huge variations between municipalities. Also, exactly like Georgia, Florida has been laggard at often getting out emergency federal dollars. Laura and I were discussing beforehand how Florida and Georgia are like number 1 and 2 in having failed to deliver the hardest hit dollars during the recession. There was some evidence that our then Governor Rick Scott was unenthusiastic about that program and the slow process was deliberate. It's possible that some similar intentionality is present now in the state Ewrap program, but I would also note that targeting the least populated areas, as our state program does, is a challenge. It makes it difficult to mobilize the sorts of on-the-ground, high-touch approaches that have helped some of our urban programs. I want to also highlight the local governments that have spent down their funds. Those are highlighted in yellow. Some have reached and surpassed the Treasury 65% threshold. And so let me just reflect a couple of things that we've observed from our research about what does work and what doesn't work. So first of all, one thing I would say has been possibly a barrier in some but not all cases, all entitlement communities get their own Ewrap funds, but in some of our counties, city governments have partnered with county programs. So while there's 2 pots of money, there's one application process. I think that works probably better than having each municipality have its own program. And that's especially true because here in the Sun Belt, often there's a lot of unincorporated county where you have the mailing address of the nearby city. So your mailing address is Orlando, but you don't live in Orlando. So what happens is that when this program is rolled out, you apply for funding from the city of Orlando, and then a process has to happen where you're rejected and sent to the proper county program. And so eventually these systems learn to talk to each other, but how much easier if you simply have one program for the county and don't have to worry about where the boundaries are. Now, obviously, this is not always a barrier because if you can see on that slide, the city of Miami has done a great job running a program independently from the county. On the plus side, things that we find are really important is having maximum collaboration. Several of the counties that I have studied have working groups that involve people from all sectors that meet regularly. As Laura said, these may be people who don't really worked together previously, but they've come together right now. And so I've seen in real time where a community leader can say to a program administrator, hey, your Haitian Creole form is really badly written, and it gets fixed immediately. And so that's the kind of thing that can happen when you have everyone sitting at the table. Another thing is keep the application simple. I would say for every document you ask someone to scan and upload, you lose an applicant, because who wants to do that? People don't have the capacity to do that. Anytime a program can incorporate self-attestation in lieu of a document like a pay stub, more people can be helped. Fact-based proxies are also used instead of elaborate documentation requirements. That's when applicants fall into a high priority category and they can skip some steps. For example, 2 counties that we study have recently identified several high poverty census tracts. If the applicant's address is located in one of those tracts, the applicant can skip some of the hardship documentation that's required. So I would say in conclusion, one Ewrap program administrator said that this is the proverbial fixing the bus while driving down the highway to describe standing up a complex program in such a short period of time. So I do have sympathy for how hard this is. But as Alora has noted, there's a history of foot dragging in some of our states, and communities that value stopping evictions can prioritize coordination and ease of program access to make sure we are improving housing stability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. We appreciate all that information, and also thank you for the application tips. So as we continue this conversation about emergency rental assistance, we will now hear from our next presenter, Rebecca Yeh. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm Rebecca Yeh. I'm a senior research analyst with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and in case you're not familiar with the coalition is solely dedicated to ensuring the lowest income and most marginalized people in our country have safe, accessible, and affordable homes. And the coalition does this through research, policy analysis and advocacy, organizing, mobilization and capacity building, and communications and education. So to me, there are several important questions inherent when we're talking about emergency rental assistance and an inclusive recovery. So one, what are programs doing to perform efficiently and get assistance to households in need? Two, what does it look like when we break it down to understand what households have been served, and how do we make sure that programs are assisting communities equitably, particularly Black and Brown communities who were more likely to be rent burdened before the pandemic and were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic? And three, what is the impact of ERA on households that received it? So that's a lot of questions, and I'm really going to focus on the first for the panel today, similar to topics that Laura and Elizabeth covered earlier. There are 2 pieces of information that I think will help us get some sense of where things are right now in terms of effective performance and having some idea of what households are served. And then kind of another caveat I want to mention is that I'll be talking a lot today kind of from a more bird's eye view, from a national perspective, and not necessarily as much in detail about local programs. So in terms of spending, Treasury emergency rental assistance programs have distributed 40% of the 25 billion ERA 1 funds as of September 30th, or about $9.9 billion of assistance. About 1/5 of grantees have spent more than 80% of their ERA 1 allocation, but over 1 in 4 grantees have spent less than 30%, including majority of state-level grantees. So to me, this indicates that programs may be doing some things that are helping them be more effective at getting funds out the door, and it's really important to really double down, and hopefully the program improvement plans that grantees had to submit earlier this week will help them do that. And so this is really kind of the main topic I'll be trying to address today. The second graphic on this slide, the point I really wanted to make here is that among these state level programs that have spent a good chunk of their ERA1 funds, they're really varying significantly in how many households in need they've been able to serve. And here we're using cost-burdened low-income households as a proxy of need. And so this is really one kind of aspect of better understanding households served. And it's really urgent that we find out more about what households that have received rental assistance look like in terms of race and ethnicity, geographic breakdown, and other key socio-demographic indicators to make sure that ERA distribution is equitable. So I'm going to set a little bit more context by going back in time. We've been able to learn a lot about how emergency rental assistance programs function, in part thanks to the efforts the coalition has undertaken to track early emergency rental assistance programs that cropped up. Programs from last year really varied widely in tenant eligibility and landlord requirements, subsidy structure, and more, in part because so many different pots of funds were being used. And all of these different funds had different levels of leniencies and stringencies. And thanks to the really wide variety, we were able to learn a lot. Another big source of what we know about emergency rental assistance programs comes from a survey we conducted last fall of 220 program administrators and case studies with 15 local emergency rental assistance programs, all of which we did with our partners at the University of Pennsylvania's Housing Initiative at Penn and NYU Furman Center. So just want to give a quick shout out to the project team, Andrew Arand, Vincent Reyna, Claudia Aiken, Julia Verbrugge, Isabel Harner, Ingrid Gold-Allen, and Tyler Hopper. So to hit on some of the big points that we found through a combination of our survey and case studies, partnership mattered. So programs that had locally embedded nonprofit partners were better able to get funds out the door. So what Laura was mentioning earlier really resonates with this finding. Certain requirements were associated with incomplete applications and really slowed things down. And so from our case studies, we were finding that a lot of programs had to have a lot of flexibility and responsiveness, especially to issues around tenants not being able to find documentation and meeting documentation requirements, or landlords not being able to meet documentation requirements. So I think that this point really also resonates with some of what Elizabeth was talking about earlier. I think overall, programs had a lot of creative tactics to boost infrastructure, tenant uptake, and landlord engagement. And a shifting policy context really made things difficult for program administrators to carry out their programs, in particular for folks that were using federal funds that kind of delayed them from getting off the ground and what have you. So if you're following along and if you want to read more or learn more about those, I have links here. The research that we did last year was really helpful and informative, and there have been a lot of opportunities to connect research to practice with different sets of stakeholders. I think that the research has really helped inform major points of advocacy with policymakers and decision makers, inform the talking points that we emphasize with the coalition's network of advocates. We also repackage information from research into reports for program administrators and what have you. One example I'll give is around self-attestation. So self-attestation was really a major point of the coalition's advocacy in order to make sure that Treasury emergency rental assistance programs could function optimally, and to make sure that tenants would be able to get assistance more smoothly. And initial guidance for the Treasury emergency rental assistance program required programs to acquire source documentation of households' income and source documentation in addition to self-attestation of COVID-19 hardship. And that was really problematic. And the fact that our research with Housing Initiative at Penn and NYU Furman Center pointed to certain requirements like COVID-related income loss being correlated to incomplete applications, and the themes that came out from our case studies around the need for flexibility in documentation requirements to increase tenant take-up, these really helped bolster the advocacy case for self-attestation. And the next iteration of guidance rescinded these initial requirements that were also from a different administration, from the previous Trump administration. So to say the least, partnership was super important here, and that our academic partners are really esteemed helped a lot, both to increase the reach of the report as well as to lend weight and credibility. So back to present time, with now $46.55 billion devoted specifically to emergency rental assistance, it's really a huge opportunity to learn more about what's working. So the coalitions continue to track key program design features, and we're continuing to partner with Housing Initiative at Penn and NYU Furman Center to conduct additional rounds of surveys. We surveyed programs in April, and we had a second round of surveys in late June, early July, and we're currently completing a final round of surveys right now. With our April survey, because so many programs were still starting out, we really focused our analysis to understand what are programs shaping up to look like, and if they changed or differed from earlier emergency rental assistance programs. So to follow on some of the themes that I've talked about so far, what was really interesting about this was all the survey respondents indicated that they allowed self-attestation, that they allowed for self-attestation of COVID-19 hardship, and many allowed for self-attestation of income. But when we cross-referenced with the coalition's database, we found that there was kind of a discrepancy there, suggesting that there's a lack of communication and transparency on these features. Staff capacity and technology were still really huge key issues, and there were really mixed results around relaxing documentation requirements. So we're analyzing the second survey in combination with the first survey right now to better understand if any program features are related to outcome metrics, like a program's share of funds spent. And we're also complementing this analysis with analysis of programs in the coalition's database of ERA programs. Again, if any program design features are related to share of funds spent, or if changes in program features over the summer are related to changes in spending performance. So there's something that we're finding that fit the pattern, and I'll share a few quick tidbits. One of the earlier threads we found was some documentation requirements slow programs down. In our analysis, we're finding that programs that allow for self-attestation had spent a slightly higher average share of their budget by the end of August and September. And when we look at that data over time, we saw that programs that adopted self-attestation over the summer had larger improvements in their spending performance between the end of June and the end of September. And so we have some more interesting information to share. That report will be coming out soonish. Keep your eyes peeled. And so I am going to end there. Looking forward to discussing.
All right. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for all of that information that you have to share with us. We will now turn to Giselle Routhier for a response to all of Rebecca's research.
Great. Thank you so much for, first of all, thank you so much for having me as part of this conversation. My name is Giselle Ruthier. I'm the postdoctoral scholar at the Health by Housing Lab in the Department of Population Health at NYU School of Medicine. My research focuses on housing insecurity, homelessness, and health. So also thank you to Rebecca Yeh and other panelists for laying out where we are with the ERA programs and many lessons learned already. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the prevalence of housing insecurity and homelessness before the pandemic began, so providing a little more historical context for where we are now. I'm also going to present some thoughts on equity and program evaluation and some implications for looking toward the future. So I pulled this chart from a recent paper I authored in the Journal of Human Rights and Social Work. And so the data show a nationally representative sample of renters from the 2017 American Housing Survey. So here, just over 46 million renter households in 2017. And what this shows, I circled two particularly relevant data points that about half of renter households in 2017 experienced some form of housing insecurity. So that could be manifested by unaffordability, living in crowded conditions, living in poor physical conditions, or recently experiencing a forced move, or some combination of those things. So that's a substantial portion of renters. So we're still talking about 22 plus million renter households. But then when we're looking at households that do experience housing insecurity in any form, the vast majority are experiencing some issue with unaffordability. So you see that about 85% of renter households who do experience insecurity experience some issue with unaffordability or paying more than 30% of their income in rent. Also, because our census surveys that are based on housing units do not include people who are experiencing homelessness, here's the latest data on a national level on trends in the number of people experiencing homelessness on any given night. So you'll see that for the past 4 years, the number of people experiencing homelessness has been rising, particularly driven by increases in unsheltered homelessness. And just as a general reminder, this is a point in time estimate for one night of the year and is not representative of everyone who may be experiencing homelessness throughout any given year. So I'm sure most of you that are on this webinar, or maybe all of you on this webinar, are aware of inequities in homelessness and housing insecurity, but I want to highlight some of these points as we think about evaluating recent policies and implementing new policies moving forward. So in particular, homelessness and housing insecurity disproportionately impact Black, Hispanic, Latinx, Native American, and Alaska Native persons, people with disabilities, among youth, people identifying as LGBTQIA+. We also know that homelessness and housing insecurity negatively impact health. So homelessness, for example, is linked with higher rates of chronic medical conditions, greater likelihood of self-rated poor health, and higher age-adjusted mortality. The COVID-19 pandemic has also impacted groups inequitably by race and ethnicity, by socioeconomic status, and by housing status, so including people who are living in congregate settings, people who've been living in crowded housing, and people who are living in carceral settings. So these COVID-19 equities have manifested in higher rates of infections, hospitalizations, and mortality. So I was recently on a webinar listening to remarks by Dr. Marcela Nunez-Smith, and she said something that I think is really relevant in this context of thinking about policy responses to housing insecurity and homelessness. She said we all must work together to disrupt the predictable pattern of who is harmed first and harmed worst. So referring kind of back to my last slide, these disparities are not likely a surprise to most people, but our question must then be, what actions are we taking to address them? So what implications for evaluating programs that respond to, what are the implications for evaluating programs that respond to current and future public health emergencies? Are programs and policy responses being designed with equity in mind? So some of these questions are starting to be answered with ongoing work done by the National Low Income Housing Coalition and Georgia Institute of Technology and University of South Florida, among many others, but we need to continue to ask them and work toward answering them. So to conclude, emergency rent assistance is so important, but we also need to think about the prevalence of housing insecurity and homelessness before the pandemic, the ongoing needs of tens of millions of renter households and the known inequities in and health effects created by housing insecurity and homelessness, we need to make sure we are asking the right questions and searching for the right solutions looking toward the future. So to that point, thinking about evaluating who might be falling through the cracks with some of these programs. So what are the barriers that may involve language or technical navigation or disconnection from information sources that some of our previous panelists have talked about? We need to think about focusing on reducing bureaucratic barriers, as was mentioned in the discussion around self-attestation, both in rent assistance and thinking about other safety net programs as well. These have implications for equity and justice. And we also need to think and remember that there's a huge need for ongoing rent assistance to stabilize millions of households and prevent future evictions, and that has critical public health and equity implications. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much, and I'll turn it back to Matushka.
Thank you, Giselle. And a key thing that you said there that I think is very important is asking the right questions. So right about now, let's open up the conversation to all our panelists. If I can have everyone turn their screens on so we can get into some Q&A and hopefully have some great questions come. We want to remind everyone that we are taking questions from our audience. To ask a question, please submit them using the Ask Question button or email them to communities@stls.frb.org. So our first question is an open one that anyone or all of you can respond to, and we can just have an open discussion about it. So sometimes the goal of quickly distributing emergency assistance funds conflicts with the goal of getting aid to the most vulnerable households who may be harder to reach. How can cities make sure they're targeting emergency resources effectively? And we can start with anyone there, anybody who wants to start in on this.
Start. I think that one of the really important things is to make sure to consider, these target households when designing the program. So making sure that you're partnering with the right organizations that are embedded with those households, making sure that the application itself and the application process isn't a barrier to folks in these target households. And then another thing that I'll mention that Giselle really made an important point around is making sure that programs are tracking their efforts around this. So having data around who they're serving and are they meeting kind of any benchmarks that they're creating to serve households in need. I think that's really important.
Anyone else want to reflect on that?
I would say that there's a variety of approaches that I've seen happen in Metro Atlanta, but one of the ones that we might not have talked about is that we've been trying to use evictions data to understand which buildings have a history of high housing instability prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic, and also using eviction filings as mailing lists to do direct outreach. And so there's been a variety of efforts around canvassing buildings that have historically very high eviction rates or currently for the first time have very high eviction rates in Georgia. And we saw some success actually with postcard outreach, where we were working with students and local legal aid groups to send out postcards, and we would use a Q code, and we could tell that we had a pretty high 30% hit rate, at least in people accessing the webpage and learning about information that was available. So those are some of the more maybe creative ways that we've tried to address this problem in Georgia.
Okay. So another question here. As many states wind down their emergency housing measures, what types of interventions or programmatic innovation should they consider making permanent?
Well, I'll jump in for a minute. I thought that Ms. Bailey's opening remarks about the importance of a robust housing assistance program are really on target here. I think the lesson for me of this experience is that we shouldn't have to ramp up these entirely new emergency systems when something really catastrophic happens, because something really catastrophic is happening all the time. I mean, we came up with emergency rental aid because we knew if people got evicted during a pandemic, there would be a public health a problem associated with that. But we're quite fine with, in my community, 1,000 eviction filings a month just being the norm. And so I feel like the issue is less how have we learned to stand up emergency programs, and how can we have a housing system that avoids needing all that emergency help.
I would absolutely agree with that point. I think a lot of people were shocked to realize that our pandemic eviction rate is low relative to our extremely high eviction rate. There's a permanent housing crisis in Georgia. When you see, something like 20% of all households receiving eviction filings in a given year, and when you look at how spatially concentrated, and we have very, very high rates of housing instability routinely, and so the level of attention around keeping people in their homes has been really welcome, and I hope it never goes away.
Yeah, I would also add importantly that, the interventions at the level of eviction moratoria and providing those extra protections to tenants can be done at the local and state level. And so that's something where, you have an opportunity to expand on policies that have worked during the pandemic at all levels of government, even as we continue to think about what the role the federal government can play in providing rent assistance for everyone who needs it, but thinking about those local and state policies as well.
So during COVID, public health concerns were the primary justification for much more expansive housing interventions than we've seen in previous recessions. Do you see an expanded role for public health and healthcare actors in responding to future housing crisis?
I can respond to this as well. I mean, I think I would sort of reverse this and say that we really want to make sure that understand that housing policy has such a big implication for public health, healthcare access, and health overall. And so moving forward, thinking about how housing policy is so important for improving public health. And so making sure people are safely and permanently housed. If they fall into homelessness, that they're rehoused quickly and with assistance that will last permanently. So I think that's something that's really critical, that this pandemic has provided a lesson for how intertwined housing stability is with your ability to maintain your health and the ability of us to maintain our public health as a society overall.
Anybody else want to add to that? All right, we'll move on because we do have a few questions. As various pandemic economic assistance programs began to form, a conversation arose about whether direct financial aid to households would be a more efficient way to assure that housing needs were met. Has your research given you any insight into how such an approach would have worked in comparison to the challenges and successes you identified with Ewrap programs?
I can answer some of this. So some of the research that we did, we asked in our surveys, we ask programs about what their key challenges are, and tenant and landlord responsiveness both have been key and ongoing challenges. And so the short answer, I think, right now is we don't have a whole lot of insights about, the success, but there's a lot of hesitancy right now in Treasury ERA programs to, I think, still do direct-to-tenant assistance, even though that's an available option. I'm mixing up all the slides now by the end, but I think that somebody mentioned that there are a lot of concerns. Laura mentioned that there were a lot of concerns around fraud and making sure that you have an audit-proof process. And that is probably one of the thing that really disconnects the most with direct to tenant assistance. There are a lot of persistent myths, things that aren't really based in like truth necessarily or reality, that persist around what tenants would do if they were receiving assistance directly. And I think that there definitely needs to be more research.
I would say that the expanded unemployment insurance was a fantastic housing program, and that was direct to household money. And I've been part of discussions around a basic income pilot here in Atlanta in the Old Fourth Ward, and have been exposed to the research on those types of programs where you're directly giving cash to needy families. And the research around those types of programs is very solid. What I think is challenging around direct-to-tenant assistance here is the institutional factor. When you've got institutions that are in charge of designing application processes and making decisions about how exactly they're going to be structured, we've seen the same. I have no doubt that this sort of program would be very effective, and I think we have a lot of similar examples and great research on them to show that this sort of program would be effective. But getting lots of different local and state organizations to buy into this idea and to design processes that do this, we run into that type of attitude that Rebecca just mentioned. And I wonder if that's the best delivery mechanism for this type of program. There are other ways to do direct-to-tenant assistance that don't involve lots of different, part of my concern about this is we're seeing a lot of spatial inequality where the urban areas of Georgia are getting more rental assistance than the rural areas because of the institutions that are effective versus those that aren't. So designing processes that don't amplify spatial inequality and that are effective at this type of delivery, I think, would be the question there.
And we have a rural question here coming up that I'm going to ask you, but I'm thinking too, I think it might have been Elizabeth talking about some of the states, dragging their feet. When we know that we have the good programs that are out there, are these programs, how do you recommend rural, urban, everybody sharing that program, and then the states, local, everybody knowing that is a good program so that they can hop on a little faster?
Yeah, I don't know of a best practice case, and maybe someone else does, but I do want to emphasize that we can't say that those are not issues. I mean, all of the places that we've talked about with really successful programs have worked closely with an array of partners that you really don't find in rural areas. But I would say that doesn't mean there are no partners in rural areas. I mean, there are legal services that serve all kinds of rural counties. There are churches and other religious institutions that serve rural counties. So I believe it takes a little bit more creativity to find these potential partners because they're not kind of sitting there called, community organization or housing organization. And perhaps that's where our state programs have not met the challenge.
So I'll follow up with that, Elizabeth, with this question that I have that is basically in response to what you were saying. Rural communities often have fewer social service organizations like those found in the most successful Ewrap communities. Any best practices or lessons you can share or learn for reaching vulnerable renters in those rural areas?
I think in Georgia there's been an attempt to use the court system and to use statewide Georgia Legal Services as navigators. And I think that if we had more time, we could troubleshoot how that's worked, but that would be the approach I would take in a state like this one. That might be one approach. So.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to make that our last question. So I would like to thank Panel 1 for sharing such thoughtful and rich insights and for all of your presentations as well. We will now take a 10-minute break. Our session will resume promptly at 3:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Well, we had a great start to today's discussion, and we want to keep that going. Let's now shift our focus to evaluating universal or the expansion of housing choice vouchers as a long-term solution for increasing housing security among renters. I'll now turn over today's program to Prentice Dantzler of the University of Toronto to continue today's program. Prentice, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matushka, and thank you all for being with us here today as we discuss housing vouchers more explicitly and what it looks like to have a universal housing voucher program going forward. So just to set the ground before we have our panelists come in, I just want to give you a couple numbers on what is the size of the program that we're actually talking about. So currently, housing vouchers serve about 2.3 million households across the country. However, only 1 in 5 eligible households actually get a voucher, right? So there's a big need as the program is being utilized. If we expand it to a universal housing voucher program, estimates say that another 8 million people could qualify. Now, typically, the federal government sets the rate at 80% of the area median income, or AMI. However, many public housing authorities across the country set their limits at around 50% to support very low-income households. And statutorily, some PHEs or a lot of PHEs are required to give 75% of their allotted vouchers to households who are at 30% below the AMI or extremely low income. Now, the purpose of the housing voucher program is to allow for flexibility for the renter to rent a unit in the private market. So this would allow greater flexibility in kind of historical programs like public housing. But we see that this has not always been the case. The program is at the whim of landlord participation and engagement, and there are different logics and feelings for landlords for engaging in the program overall. Some of those deal with regulations. So there are a lot of regulations that explicitly different PHAs set for their landlords to participate in the program. And these are in conjunction with some of the other kind of local rules and regulations of their contextual environments. Some landlords have feelings about the rents not really meeting their individual needs when they can rent to higher income individuals. There's always been this kind of deep stigma attached to the renters themselves and what they actually bring to the table. And this has carried on from other housing assistance programs as well. And it also just introduces another relationship between an individual landlord and the government. And there could be a lack of government trust between those individuals and bureaucracy as it is in function. So today we're going to talk about what does this look like on the ground from some amazing panelists. And I would like to pass it off first to Dr. Greg Colburn from the University of Washington.
Thanks, Prentice. I really appreciate it. I'm going to use my time today to provide a little more context, and Prentice did a nice job of setting the table for us, but some context which will hopefully then lead into Eva and Vincent's presentation. Let me make sure my screens are working here. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of the federal government's involvement in housing policy, and if this is well known to you, I apologize for the redundancy. But the federal government's only been involved in serving low-income households their housing needs for less than 100 years. And so the public housing program began during the New Deal policymaking of the Great Depression. And what's distinct about that program is that it's a supply-side benefit in the sense that the government constructs and operates housing and then provides housing units directly to eligible recipients, program participants. So that would be state provision. And beginning in the 70s, we end up with this shift where we start to elevate rental assistance in the form of housing vouchers as the primary mode of housing support. Public housing still exists, but vouchers become the primary means. And it really changes the dynamic for program participants. Instead of a supply-side benefit, this is a demand-side benefit in which the government provides purchasing power to eligible recipients, and they go into the private market and use that voucher. So the experiences of a public housing resident and a voucher user are very, very different. And that's what we as researchers think about, especially as we think about the outcomes of the program. So an astute observer might say, well, what prompted this shift? There are a bunch of reasons, and I'm going to go through a few quickly. But there was a general consensus at the time that the public housing programs had failed, or at least in part had failed. And this idea certainly had an influence on policymaking during the 70s and 80s. And subsequent scholarship has really questioned whether, in fact, that's the case. But there's no doubt that this feeling had an impact on policymaking. This shift is also really consistent with global policymaking during the 70s and 80s, in which it kind of took this neoliberal turn, in which it elevated private markets as an important mechanism in policymaking. And during President Reagan's first term, there was a commission on housing, and there's a quote in there which is really right out of the neoliberal playbook, which is, "The genius of the market economy, freed of distortions, can provide for housing far better than federal programs." Right? So we see this play out in the voucher program. The same report also identified the fundamental issue, and it's contested whether in fact this is accurate or not, but their assessment was that the problem in the United States was not deficits in housing quantity or quality, but rather deficits in income. And so if that logic is correct, they argued that why should we be in the business of constructing and operating housing when we could simply be providing purchasing power to households, right? And that logic prevailed. And finally, there were certainly concerns about concentrations of race and poverty in public housing. And as Prentice mentioned, the Housing Choice Voucher Program emphasized some autonomy and choice for program participants to live in the neighborhoods where they want to live. And so that clearly is part of the program setup. So where are we now? If we think about the voucher program, I think most people who study this program would agree that it has provided essential support to millions of households in the United States. That's really not in doubt. But the program certainly has fallen short in some respects of some of its stated goals. But I would argue that really the fundamental shortcoming of the program is its scale. As Prentice mentioned, only 1 in 5 people who are eligible for federal benefits actually get them, which leads to really long and frustrating waits for people who would like access to this program. And it stands in contrast to other public assistance programs, such as food support in the United States, which is available to all eligible households. So expansion of the voucher program would not be a policy anomaly. In fact, it would be consistent with other sources of public assistance that we provide. So when we structure programs this way, in essence, giving people purchasing power and sending them into the private market, it invites a lot of important questions that have occupied researchers for the last couple of decades. Can recipients access the goods and services, in this case, housing that they need and want? Can they effectively compete in the private market against other unsubsidized households? Do they have full access to the market, or do they only access a subset? And do some recipients have more success than others? Right? So lots of important questions, and lots of research attempt to do that. I'm a second career academic. My first career was in the financial markets, so I really have a strong interest in the relationship between markets and the state. And the voucher program is obviously an interesting case study of that. And so I've thought a lot about how different contexts and specifically different market conditions affect voucher recipients. So intuitively, it's not surprising to think that the experience of someone in Topeka, Kansas who gets a voucher might be different than someone living in San Francisco. Okay? And so my point and my research would argue that context matters. Market conditions and policy features interact, produce different outcomes in different settings. And it's important for us to understand that. So this graph comes from some research that I published a couple years ago, and it's using data from the American Housing Survey. That survey has a subsample called the recent mover subsample, and it asks people questions who have recently moved. It's a really interesting set of data. And two of the questions that I found interesting were, after your move, is your current housing better or worse than your previous housing? And is your current neighborhood better or worse than your previous neighborhood? And so there are two observations here. What I do in the sample is I only include households that are eligible based on income for the voucher program. And so I end up with two categories, those who got a voucher and then a larger group who didn't get the voucher. So two observations here. One is, it is easier for households to improve their housing as vacancy rates increase, which is probably consistent with intuition. A less constrained market provides greater opportunities for households. And we also see the benefit of the purchasing power for voucher households here, that they're much more likely to improve their housing than their non-voucher peers. But what's interesting is when the question turns to neighborhood, the story is a little bit more complicated. Again, it's easier to improve your neighborhood as vacancy rates are higher, but what we see is this kind of interesting interaction between voucher receipt and market conditions. And so when you get to the left side in really, really tight housing markets, at times the voucher can be potentially a disincentive for landlords who have lots of options in a really tight market or other factors. But the point being that market conditions can have an impact on the ability of voucher holders to achieve better neighborhood outcomes. And so I live and work in Seattle. We're in the midst of a really severe housing and homelessness crisis out here. And so when people ask me, Greg, what can we do? What I say is if I had a magic wand, I would do two things. One is I would make the voucher program universal, and everyone who's eligible would have access to it. And then we as a community here in the Puget Sound region need to make a local commitment to housing production. And if we can pair greater voucher provision with greater supply of housing, I think we can make a big dent in the problem that we face here. And that's certainly the case in Seattle. There are other locations in Topeka where simple expansion of the voucher program might be more than sufficient to deal with the needs that exist in that community. So as I wrap up here, I think what's important for all of us is to give ourselves space and a little grace to deal with some of the complexity and contradiction. This is a complex federal program, and so it's okay to acknowledge that the program may work better in some circumstances than others. I think it's okay to support expansion of the program while also highlighting programmatic shortcomings. This isn't a static program. This can improve over time. I also think it's important to note that voucher expansion doesn't preclude support for other really important housing programs like the existing stock of public housing or other production subsidies and tax credits. So I think this is a really unique opportunity to potentially improve the lives of millions of people in this country, and I appreciate the opportunity. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Eva Rosen from Georgetown University. Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Greg. And I am excited to continue this conversation. I think there's some really interesting synergies between what we're talking about. So I'm seeing a message that I need to share my slides, but I want to make sure that they're getting shared on the other end. Am I wrong about this?
We are. Go ahead. You can give us prompts or you could share here in Zoom.
Great. Okay. That must be a mistake. Awesome. So really happy to be here today. And what I want to talk about today is a research project from my book about housing vouchers that came out in 2020 and will be out in paperback this May. And so the book that I'll tell you about is an ethnography of a policy. It's really an ethnography of the voucher program. So I really explore what vouchers were originally meant to do, what policymakers have come to hope that they can do, and then also what they actually do and fail to do. And in particular, I want to highlight the experiences of two groups that are really important when it comes to housing vouchers. So tenants, of course, on the one hand, and then also landlords, both of which we've heard Prentice and Greg talk about already just a bit. Next slide. So really briefly, Prentice covered this. Just some basic facts about housing vouchers. By the late 90s, of course, vouchers became the largest housing assistance program in the country. And as Prentice mentioned, the voucher subsidizes a cost of the unit in the private market, in theory, allowing families to access homes that they otherwise would not be able to afford. What's important for my purposes, thinking about both the landlord side and the tenant side, is that households pay 30% of their income in rent. The government pays the rest directly to the landlord, who must pass an inspection. And as Prentice mentioned, anyone earning under a certain income threshold is eligible, but only 1 in 4, or by some estimates 1 in 5 households who would qualify actually receives housing assistance. And my case study is Baltimore. So if you take Baltimore as an example, the waiting list is actually quite a bit longer than the list of people who actually even receive aid, and it's so long that it's very frequently closed for years at a time. Importantly, too, I want to mention that that the program, which we may know as Section 8, was renamed the Housing Choice Voucher Program in 1998. And this really reflects the importance that policymakers put on promoting geographic opportunity through choice, right? And Greg really pointed to this idea that that choice was a big part of the intentions of this policy. So on slide 3, there were a number of big questions that really motivated this research for me. And the first was, very generally speaking, where do poor people move and why, right? And existing research illuminates all kinds of preferences that folks may have about where they want to live, whether related to geography or race or social networks, as well as the role that discrimination plays. But I felt like we had a lot more to learn about what choice actually looks like for vouchers and what kinds of constraints were acting upon those choices. So what factors get in the way of these preferences, and how does this actually unfold on the ground? How do we see this relationship between tenants and landlords? More broadly, I also wondered whether we should actually expect that a market-based program could or would produce different outcomes than the broader housing market already does. And I think that's sometimes something that gets lost in the shuffle. So today I'll really focus, though, on this first question of what choice actually looks like and how it's constrained. On the next slide, the data slide, so to study these questions, I moved to a neighborhood in Baltimore called Park Heights, where I conducted about 15 months of field work. And Baltimore has one of the highest voucher rates for large cities in the U.S. In the neighborhood that I studied, it's even higher than for Baltimore as a whole. So nearly 17% of rentals are occupied by voucher holders in this neighborhood. A third of residents here are poor, and the neighborhood is quite segregated. 96% of residents are Black. During my research, I got to know residents, their friends, families, and neighbors. I went to family dinners, church on Sunday, tagged along for daily errands, and most importantly, accompanied families on housing searches. And I really wanted to identify all the different actors who were relevant to this question. So I studied the homeowners who had bought their homes in this neighborhood in the 60s, and then, of course, also the more recent influx of voucher holders, as well as unassisted renters who got no help from the government, and then also the landlords who house all these folks. Next slide. So in the first few chapters of the book, I examine what the program's meant to do, both officially and unofficially, and also how these goals actually play out on the ground for voucher recipients. So on the one hand, vouchers are meant to provide stable housing, and research shows that they do this quite well. So the program appears to improve housing affordability, reduce homelessness, alleviate overcrowding. These are all really important basic housing goals that the program seems to actually be doing quite well at. On the next slide. So I then tell the stories of the unassisted renters who, of course, don't receive any housing assistance. And their stories make quite clear how much worse off they are in terms of basic shelter and housing stability, and paint a picture of just how hard it is to make ends meet without housing assistance. So one woman I met, Destiny Stevens, who lives in a room for rent, she shares this one bedroom with her husband and 2 kids. The family carries their own roll of toilet paper to the bathroom that they share with the 4 other adults who live in the house. And Destiny's been on the waiting list for the voucher program for several years. Also, Tina Jackson, who moved to Park Heights with her 13-year-old daughter when she lost her home in East Baltimore because she couldn't afford to repair the roof. And now they share a 2-bedroom apartment, but the complex is dangerous and Tina's afraid to go outside. She's been on the Section 8 wait list for years also. In contrast, I tell the stories of several people who received a housing voucher and the way in which it changed their lives for the better, providing stability and shelter. And people describe this like winning the lottery, which in a way it really is, because in most places the voucher program is run much like a lottery. So Vivian Warner was able to move off her sister's couch where she had been staying. Because she then had a house of her own, she was able to regain custody of her twin boys. Or Tony Young is a 55-year-old man with HIV, was able to move out from under the bridge where he had been sleeping into a 1-bedroom apartment with heat and electricity. And with the stability, he was able to take his meds more regularly and his health improved. Or Joanne Jones, a mother of 2, who used some of the extra money freed up by the voucher to buy fresh fruit and vegetables for her kids and cook meals for them. And indeed, the quantitative research shows that one of the first things people do with the money that the voucher frees up is buy more food. Beyond this kind of stability provided by vouchers, many policymakers, of course, have also come to hold a secondary hope for the program. And that is that it would provide choice and perhaps even get people to new neighborhoods to create some kind of residential mobility. But this goal is less easily achieved. And Edie Baxter's story illustrates why. So Edie is one of the women that I met in Park Heights. She's in her 50s now, but she was born in public housing in the Flag homes. And she moved out when she was a teen. She bounced around to a lot of different homes, many of them poor quality, many of them in dangerous neighborhoods. She got on the Section 8 wait list when she was pregnant with her first daughter. By the time she actually got off the wait list and received her voucher, her daughter was 8 years old. Despite the wait, though, Edie was thrilled. During this time she had been waiting, she read up on all the rules. She knew exactly how to use the voucher. She knew she could use it basically anywhere she wanted as long as it was affordable. And she was really excited to move to the county. She had always dreamed of living in a suburb called Owings Mills and having more trees and green space around. But when she went to visit homes in the suburbs, landlords turned her away one after another, basically telling her, "We don't take vouchers here." And this kind of discrimination is a quite common experience. It can be hard to use the voucher in more affluent neighborhoods. And what's more, it can be hard to use a voucher at all due to stigma surrounding the program. HUD data on housing voucher success rates suggests that something like 30% of voucher holders are unable to use their vouchers at all. So Edie couldn't move to the suburbs, but she did move to an apartment complex in Park Heights where a lot of voucher holders live. Nevertheless, the voucher changed her life. It offered her stability. It offered her a better quality home. She doesn't have to worry about where she and her daughter will sleep, but she didn't have a ton of say in where she ended up. Next slide. So in the next part of the book, I look at why people like Edie don't have as much choice as we might hope. And what I found is that there's really a missing piece of the puzzle in the way we think about housing voucher use. A key actor who affects residential decisions on this really simple and fundamental level, someone related to both supply and demand, and next slide, that is, of course, landlords. So while a new body of research has demonstrated quite a bit about how landlords play a role in selecting tenants out through the process of eviction, and we've all been talking a lot about eviction lately, we still know relatively little about the role that landlords play in selecting tenants in, right? So how they make decisions about what makes a desirable tenant, and the role that they play in sorting tenants across neighborhoods in the city. Next slide. So what I quickly realized was that I couldn't really tell this story about tenants and voucher holders without also telling the story of their landlords. So one of the landlords I got to know, David, stands outside the voucher office in Baltimore to recruit voucher tenants on their way out the door. And on any given day, you can find landlords like David waiting there, offering to drive tenants up to vacant units, offering incentives like customizing the paint color or waiving the security deposit, even offering move-in cash bonuses to voucher tenants. But these are a specific type of landlord. They're the ones with hard-to-rent properties in disadvantaged neighborhoods like the one that I studied, Park Heights. And they do this because voucher tenants are so desirable in this type of neighborhood. So in areas like Park Heights, finding and attracting tenants who are able to pay their rent reliably is just not an easy task. And a basic fact for landlords in Baltimore is that many low-income renters simply can't afford to pay. So this provides an incentive for landlords to entice voucher holders to these units, since a big chunk of their rent is paid for by the housing authority. Next slide. So Oscar explains, everybody prefers Section 8. It's tough times now. If the tenant doesn't pay the mortgage, you have to. Section 8 ensures that you're going to get your money. And in fact, landlords can sometimes get a premium above market rate. In a neighborhood like Park Heights, landlords report that they can get several $100s more from a voucher than they can from a market tenant. Because of this, the program appeals to a certain segment of landlords who have now oriented their businesses towards attracting and retaining voucher holders. Next slide. Now, this set of practices, from waiting outside the office to offering move-in bonuses, falls in a category of targeting tactics that landlords use to entice tenants to their properties in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And this results in a sort of predatory inclusion, where voucher holders aren't really making full choices about where to live, but rather being lured into some less than ideal neighborhoods where they probably wouldn't otherwise end up. At the same time, there's exclusion from more affluent neighborhoods. Outside of Park Heights, the program is highly stigmatized, and landlords frequently discriminate against voucher tenants. Most cities and states don't have adequate legal protections for voucher holders. There's, of course, no national SOI law preventing a landlord from discriminating against a voucher holder. And because landlords' motives are aligned with their own bottom line, not necessarily with the greater good, we see this dual trend of inclusion and exclusion contributing to patterns of segregation and inequality in voucher use. And due to all this, the lack of legal protections for voucher holders, the persistence of racial discrimination, and the role of landlords more broadly, I think it's fair to say that choice among voucher holders is somewhat of a fiction, right? The potential is there, but it's largely unrealized. Next slide. So I won't go into this because I know I'm out of time, and I think this is actually probably a great place for our conversation as a panel. But, I think the key take home here is that sort of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? I actually think that expanding the program like Greg could solve a lot of these problems. And there are some smaller tweaks that we can make to the program as well that I think are especially important to make if we are talking about scaling up the program and making it potentially universal. So I'll leave things there and pass things along to Vincent Reyna. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Eva. It's a pleasure to be here today and excited for this conversation, and feel truly honored to be with the group of panelists and discussants throughout the event today. So my name is Vincent Reyna. I'm an associate professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of Pennsylvania and the faculty director of the Housing Initiative at Penn. So as we've heard thus far from some of the discussion we're having, clearly there's a lot of challenges with the voucher program as is, and there's a lot of kind of suggestions. Eva's last slide really kind of runs through those nicely, so hopefully we get to discuss those in more detail about ways to improve the program as is, right? Looking at voucher use rates, whether someone could actually use their voucher, looking at landlord participation, which clearly affects not just where if vouchers can be used, but also where vouchers can be used, which kind of connects very actively to kind of research on neighborhood access and looking at the kinds of neighborhoods that people access with their voucher. What's interesting, though, is as we look across all these things, probably one of the most defining characteristics of the voucher program, as highlighted from some stats that have been thrown out, is essentially its scarcity, right? Which is the fact that there are far more eligible households than there are those who receive it, right? So I'm here in the city of Philadelphia. There's currently about 10,000 people on the wait list, and it's closed, and it's been closed for some time. I'm currently working with the city of Los Angeles in an evaluation of their voucher lottery in 2017. We estimated somewhere about 500,000 households were eligible for the voucher lottery. A little less than 200,000 households actually applied. 20,000 got put on the wait list, and they're being offered a voucher as someone who's currently using one no longer uses their voucher. So as has been said before, there are 2.3 million households currently who are using a voucher. So what we did first is some modeling to look at voucher scenarios if the voucher was universal at 30% of area median income, 50% of area median income. So again, this is still means tested, so not truly universal, but universal to everyone below these income thresholds. And what we found is essentially only about 1 in 5 households eligible for a voucher actually received one and was able to use it at this point in time. What we did in this data analysis is we actually looked also at the number of households within a housing unit. And so you'll see kind of in these presentations, there's some wonder, is it 1 in 4? Is it 1 in 5? We can all agree that there's undersupply. What we did here is we tried to acknowledge the fact that some households would essentially decouple if they were offered the ability to actually access a voucher and look for a unit on their own, which is how we came with this 1 in 5 count. So you can look at this report. It's an interactive report. It's the website's there on the bottom, housinginitiative.org / I believe that is, vouchers. So, but I'm going to walk you through some features here. One of the things we did is we allow you to kind of see state by state what the voucher gap is by state. So here you can see the state of Texas. There's a very significant voucher gap between what we estimate as the total eligible households at 50% of area median income versus the actual number of households that are currently being served by the program. One thing that's important, though, is that clearly the state of Texas, being one of the most populous states, is going to have the largest numeric gap. So one of the things we did also then is we actually then tried to essentially weight that gap by the renter population to also show essentially the relative impact of what a universal voucher would have on housing markets across the country. And so what you can see here is in a place like Orlando, MSA, even though the raw number is smaller than other places like Los Angeles, relative to the renter population, they actually have the larger relative voucher gap by population. We also did a little bit of a dive into who would be served by a universal voucher, right? What you can see is kind of it will assist a broad set of households, and what you can also see actually on the website as well is looking at MSAs, but then also drilling down to rural areas as well to get a picture of what it looks like across the country. So one thing that's clear is there's a clear undersupply of housing vouchers, right? And as many of the speakers before have said, a move towards universalizing them, so that way it's not a case where someone could potentially lose one and never get one again. It's not a case where people are waiting on wait lists, maybe don't even apply because they're nervous about their ability to actually get on the wait list and actually make it through it. Right? Actually making it universal to everyone would clearly kind of increase access. We all know that not 100% of households actually use the voucher they're offered, right? For a broad set of reasons. So this policy shift wouldn't negate the need to make really important structural changes to the program itself to make it work better, but clearly can actually address one of the largest issues, which is this undersupply in the program itself. Clearly, an important factor in this, though, is to consider that you need an actual supply of housing units. So Greg said this early on in his presentation, right, is the idea that you can't just have vouchers, you actually need to invest in the supply of housing. What's interesting right now is that there's some studies that look at, the effect of vouchers on supply of units. But one of the challenges, right, is that it's in this constrained model, right, where essentially there's not enough vouchers in a market, but also that the voucher being a mobile subsidy actually can move with someone, right? So this raises a lot of questions, right? If we get to a universal voucher, could the program on its own kind of instigate more of a supply side response, right? If an owner knows that essentially one voucher household, if they move, could be replaced with another voucher household, does that make them more likely to make the investments in their units to get to housing quality standards? Does that make them more able to actually leverage voucher rents for a private loan, right? So what you can actually see is that making the voucher universal might actually make some of the supply side reactions more feasible because it's no longer the scarce entity and owners can actually kind of factor it into their business model in some ways that Eva already said that in some markets they're doing, but more broadly across multiple markets, right? Beyond that, what's interesting is you could actually project base some vouchers, which means that you can actually commit a certain share of voucher pools to specific properties. So by virtue of doing that, you could create a supply side response by project basing a certain share of these universal vouchers to actually place-based units, right? Beyond that, there's a lot of potential opportunities, right? Can complementary programs be created to ensure an adequate supply response, right? So there's potential opportunities to essentially pair vouchers with some kind of loan guarantee program run by a local city, right? To create public programs that are more actively kind of tied to the voucher itself, knowing that there's essentially more guarantee that there will be access to more households who can actually use the voucher and you would get the voucher rents for that given unit. Clearly, zoning and regulatory reform is a clear part and undertone of any supply response. And beyond that, clearly we shouldn't just think of vouchers as a panacea, right? Place-based production programs and investment programs can actually leverage the voucher program, but actually can and should work independently of the program in and of itself. And this program, while the demand is high, we shouldn't necessarily expect it to have to meet all of this demand. Some of that demand would be met through these other forms of investment and supply responses. One of the things I want to highlight, though, is that as we kind of think about a universal voucher or even the voucher as is, we have to also actually understand, where the demand for the voucher sits, both geographically and demographically. And so in research, one of the things I find with the colleague Claudia Aiken in a paper we recently published in Urban Affairs Review is that the share of low-income households is increasingly headed by seniors and pre-seniors. So no offense to anyone on the call today. We define seniors as 62 and up because we were kind of following some HUD thresholds of data, and we call pre-seniors 50 to 61. You can argue whether those are actually pre-seniors and seniors, but either way, older individuals, right, are increasingly comprising a larger share of our low-income population, and they're increasingly comprising a larger share of HUD-subsidized housing programs. That's significant for multiple reasons, not the least of which is if we're currently relying on the recycling program, right, we're saying that people who are nearing the end of their income earning age or past it, right, are increasingly consuming a larger share of our subsidized housing stock, which means that we might expect less churning within the programs, which means fewer vouchers actually become available going forward, right? And what's interesting is that we see when we look across specific subsidized housing programs, the program that's aging the most is the voucher program, right? The share percentage point increase of seniors and pre-seniors who are comprising the voucher program increased most dramatically in that program itself, right? And so what that means is, again, that turning, right, becomes more challenging, but also it really enters a lot of questions in how we conceptualize notions of opportunity, right? How we think about this emphasis on mobility, right? A lot of evaluations of the voucher program are based on opportunity metrics that are based on economic opportunity, economic growth, intergenerational kind of transfers of economic opportunity, all of those kinds of things. But what does it mean if increasingly seniors are comprising a larger share of this program going forward? How do we think of mobility versus remaining in place and these aspects of actual choice, right? Is it choice to move? Is it choice to remain, right? And so really revisiting these concepts of opportunity to acknowledge the changing demographics, the changing realities, but also the broad set of needs that this program is actually trying to meet, right? Beyond that, we need to kind of think more broadly about issues of access, right? How do we increase access to assistance? This connects actually very actively to some of the conversations earlier on, right? Creating more flexible assistance programs. Some of that can be done outside of housing assistance programs completely and should be done, and some can and should be done within it as well, right? So one of the things I want to highlight is we're creating a program in the city of Philadelphia. It's a 3-year pilot program that's launching in 2022, where essentially we're targeting people currently on the Philadelphia Public Housing Authority waiting list for essentially a randomized control trial where we're giving people a basic income that's sized in the same way as a voucher, or they're getting no additional support. We're pulling from the wait list, one, because it's so large, but also from an equity perspective is that we didn't want to recruit folks for these for the study when we knew that there was going to be a control group who would not be able to receive assistance. So here that control group is households who are already waiting on the wait list, and so they would still be on the wait list. They would not lose their position, but they would essentially enter this study. So what we're going to be doing is essentially offering these assistance and tracking households over a 3-year period. Again, we're targeting households with children. This is not meant to be viewed as a way of kind of pitting one safety net versus the other. This is a sincere acknowledgement that we need to kind of broaden our conception of how we provide assistance, right? This is not a new idea, but we are testing it in new ways, right? And so all to say is we're really excited about this project and the findings and what this can mean for kind of complementarities for the voucher program itself, but also for looking at more flexible forms of assistance going forward. So as we think of policy implications, right, it's important to kind of view vouchers as an important part of our broader safety net and program and policy responses, right? It's clear that improvements can be made to the program as is, and we focused a lot on that in our research, but expansion is clearly one of those, right? And what does expansion actually mean then for a whole set of new questions that we want to ask about the program? And how does that actually affect some of the relationships of what we're seeing in the program? Those supply responses, what it means for how people use it, what it means for labor force participation, what it means for overall welfare across health, across housing stability, across neighborhood choice, across neighbor ability to kind of remain in place. And clearly also there needs to be still new and distinct and complementary programs. We're seeing kind of a whole host of these things really coming to the forefront with a lot of the federal conversations around this topic, and I'm really excited to have that conversation here today. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it back to Prentice.
Thank you, Vincent. And thank you to Eva, Vincent, and Greg for kind of outlining the different contextual features as the program has been coming in and how we've seen it operate across different contexts. So I'm just going to sum up a little bit of this, but what I want to do is double down on some of the ideas and the thoughts that have been raised among some of my peers, right? And then kind of beginning with Greg's presentation or overall focus is this really kind of big focus on the state versus the market provisions as we're seeing being implemented through the housing voucher program, right? So we have this long history of seeing public housing as a major source of housing assistance shifting to housing vouchers as a deeply tied space within this dynamic. And what we noticed that when you're introducing another kind of actor, right, the private market, there is this kind of deep-seated intervention about what is supposed to be the long-term relationship between private individuals serving as landlords, but also the state and institutionalizing and functioning this program. And we see that there's this kind of big disconnect, and it's really not serving all of the needs or all of the people that could be in need through the use of this program. And even in kind of Eva's work in her book, if you haven't read it, please do. It's a great book. Really kind of touching base and really digging in deep in the case study of Baltimore, seeing that, no, for a lot of landlords, they actually prefer people with housing vouchers. For some of these people in kind of lower income neighborhoods, this is a preferred because it is reliable rent. And it draws out bigger connections to really think about why landlords see this as a viable option versus looking at kind of market rate renters living in these spaces. And it's kind of a loss there, right? They don't see kind of higher income people moving into these neighborhoods. So they're utilizing the government to support their ownership of housing in these spaces. And lastly, kind of Vincent's like really kind of understanding of this gap, right? Where is the need and where is it not serving? But also this demographic aging piece that goes along with that story. And we see similarities between public housing, right? A lot of the newer public housing redevelopment and development has been focused on more senior living, and we start to see these same types of trends and patterns within a housing voucher program. But it makes us really rethink, if that's the case, will housing vouchers also have the same type of legacy as public housing? And that's something I fear for the program going on. So as we are pushing for this idea of a universal housing voucher, we need to be conscious and contend with the political debate that is going to definitely erupt as we have these debates about changing this, this housing subsidy into an entitlement program, right? As it is in a lot of different ways. So for me, this kind of ranges in three different ways. One, I see this as a huge economic issue that we should really be addressing, right? Housing is a private good, and even the people who are living there are treated as a private good, right? Landlords are looking at different types of renters to live in their spaces. They're looking for reliable income or rents to come into and use to pay their mortgages. And there are different types of landlords that we've been discussing there. Everybody's not the high capacity, large developer. You have a lot of small landlords that are occupying and providing housing for other people, and especially in lower income, extremely poor neighborhoods as well. This also becomes a bigger question about if we relieve some of the housing burden for families, particularly families of racialized groups in this country, does that lead to long-term wealth accumulation? And within housing policy, particularly federal housing policy, the focus has always been homeownership, without realizing that people change between states of being renters and homeowners over their life course overall, right? So if we're really thinking about getting into more kind of wealth equity among racial groups, we need to start thinking about housing policy as a way to do just that. The other piece in terms of the democratic piece, or the effects to democracy that this could have, and I bring this up that I've been talking to a lot of people recently, and this has also came up in Kara Rodriguez's book at UPenn, thinking about if public housing used to be the capacity to cluster lower income people together, it was also the place where they could organize and fight for their own services and social services in their local context. So if voucher programs are going to be universal, how can we even think about political discourse or the political capacity for groups of lower incomes to organize in these spaces? Or could there be tenant councils that can accompany housing vouchers? Because we know that homeowners dictate a lot of the changes that happens across different neighborhoods, whether they're low income or higher income spaces. And lastly, to kind of double down on this idea of racial divide, we do know that there's a lot of stigma still tied to any type of form of assistance. And while we're seeing movement in terms of source of income discrimination laws that are coming up across different states, we know that different states favor landlords versus tenants or tenants versus landlords. There is not a federal, push to have these things done at that level. So then what does it say to kind of double down on that stigma if we're really not addressing the real ways in which institutions, governments, local municipalities still racialize groups, people, households, and neighborhoods without doing it through the same overt language that it did historically? And for a lot of the work I've been doing, kind of looking at public housing and also mobility rates, some of the stuff that we've also been doing here in the United States and also in Canada is to look at how different policymakers and politicians and even real estate actors describe the housing need. And you'll see very much differences across different spaces where some are describing it as a need where, some people need housing vouchers. These are the people that we need it for the most. And some are saying, no, it's entitlement, it's a deservedness, it's going to make them lazy, it's going to make them not work. And we really need to kind of think about how can we disrupt that kind of narrative and that discourse if we're thinking about a very much universal housing program going forward as well. So with that being said, I want to kind of give my panelists and everybody to kind of think about some of the policy levers and interventions that we can do here today. I know a lot of you all raised it up at the end of your presentations, but I want to make sure that we give time for you to kind of double down or expand upon any of the thoughts you had about policy recommendations for the current housing voucher program and also a way to push it forward to more universal use. Anybody could take a stab at it, whether Greg, Vincent, or Eva. What are some of the policy recommendations that you think you can kind of support now?
I can jump in. I think I'll speak sort of directly to the kinds of policy recommendations that I think flow from the work that I've done, which I've really thought about in terms of if landlords are having this undue influence as sort of third-party actors, right, between the state and landlords, and if landlords are very much pursuing their own interests, but we also need them and want them to be partners in this program, then what are some things that we can do to minimize the power and influence that landlords have and maximize the choice and options that tenants have? And actually, I think in that regard, some of the fixes are fairly small and simple and involve things like offering security deposit assistance to tenants, which actually would be a great thing anyway, because if you are low enough income to need a voucher, you are probably low enough income that you're going to have a hard time coming up with a full month's rent if you don't have a security deposit assistance program. But what came directly out of the qualitative research was this notion that landlords were using that security deposit as a way to almost not coerce, but make an offer that was too good to refuse, right? If you can't come up with a security deposit and you know that a landlord's willing to waive it for you, but the only landlord that's willing to waive it for you is the one in the neighborhood that had a shooting last week, well, you might be more likely to go to that neighborhood because it's the only one you don't have to come up with a security deposit for. So something, a program like that, which has been tested out in various places and many people do benefit from, I think could do a lot to sort of minimize that undue influence of the landlord. Other simple things like transportation assistance for housing searches, right? If we think that we want people to be able to explore neighborhoods they might not otherwise move to, they're going to need a car to probably get to some of those neighborhoods. And so at the very least, offering them that assistance for the search, I think would be helpful. There's also the issue of getting them a car once they actually move there. But those are two small things that I think could do a lot to allow tenants to have a bit more choice and to sort of reduce the influence of the landlord in a way that isn't hurting the landlord either and isn't discouraging their participation.
I would just add to that, thinking about programs that run in connection with the voucher program to help units actually get to housing quality standards, right? And so housing rehab programs, particularly for smaller multifamily properties where a lot of the lower cost rental units often are, right? Or relatively lower cost, right? And so acknowledging that a unit has to meet housing quality standards, and that can actually be a barrier for a household who is trying to lease a unit, right? It can also, through those programs, create a real incentive for owners to make those investments and have the conduits for actually doing it, right? So really acknowledging the housing quality piece is something that broader housing investments and programs targeted towards that could really help with respect to voucher use rates, right? Source of income protection is clearly an important policy tool for making sure that, owners can't discriminate against voucher households. Clearly that still needs to be enforced, right? For households to really realize that right. But you see, even having that in place is a really important tool. But kind of viewing these things as a broad suite of things that need to come together, right? This movement towards creating small area fair market rents. My research shows that, and that of others have shown that, it can be an important policy tool. Again, none of these things are a panacea, right? And so I come back to, again, the idea that if you move towards things like expansion, though, a lot of these things become more scalable and realistic to actually pursue. The markets actually respond to that more actively, right? And so the undersupply really kind of limits the ability to make some of these broad stroke improvements that would really functionally change use rates, ability to remain in place or choose somewhere else, all of those kinds of things.
So we had Greg, if you wanted to jump in before Okay.
So that was a great summary. You can move on, Prentice.
Okay. We had a couple questions come in. So the first question is, how can the voucher program encourage landlords to take on tenants who they may perceive as more risky? So, so Eva and Rissa, you kind of spoke to this a little bit, but if anything, you wanted to add it on to this particular question.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we're seeing, especially during COVID times, is a lot of PHAs playing around with different kinds of landlord incentives. And there's a number of studies and experiments going on with this as well, trying to figure out what if we offered like a damage insurance pool to landlords to sort of let them know that if they're worried that a voucher tenant might be more likely to do damage. I'm not sure there's any evidence that that's true, but this is a common concern from landlords. We have this insurance pool that you can draw from so that you don't have to worry about that. I think that, in research I've done subsequently to the research for this book with landlords directly, one of the biggest things that has been really clear from landlords is that their biggest concern is actually not with the tenants. It's with the PHAs and it's with the bureaucratic red tape that's involved in getting set up with the PHA and sort of getting that first payment and passing those yearly inspections. And so there have been other ideas thrown around too. For example, landlords who regularly pass inspections might not have to submit to a yearly inspection. It might be a biannual inspection, or sort of some basic fixes at the PHA level that would just sort of make everything run more smoothly and more quickly, so that when a landlord was considering a voucher tenant and a market rate tenant, it didn't take 3 months for that first payment to come in with a voucher tenant. And I think that's a big concern. That requires some basic bureaucratic streamlining. But if we could do that, I feel quite confident that we could convince a whole number of landlords to experiment with the program in a way that they might not be willing to otherwise.
Yeah, and I just add to that, like, one thing to keep in mind is the program's structured such that a household pays 30% of their income towards rent, and the government pays the difference. So actually, that's a lot less risky, right? Because the downside risk of loss of income is essentially absorbed by the ability for that subsidy amount to change. And so that kind of builds on Eva's comment of the administrator really having an important role here, which is that those adjustments happening in real time, right, to ensure that that loss of income instantly results in that kind of change in share over time. So really focusing on, one, clarity about the fact that actually there is no risk, right? In many ways, this program actually reduces a lot of the payment risk, right? And beyond that, a lot of the efficiency really then flows on the administrators to make sure that highlighting the fact that this is actually a more kind of guaranteed stream of rental revenue by virtue of that can be a really kind of powerful way, but they need to actually be able to fulfill on that.
I'll move on to the next question. I'll probably direct this at Greg too, just to bring him in a little bit more too. So the next question was, many voucher holders value remaining close to their existing family or social networks. We've seen this through, previous kind of housing social experiments. For Black and Latinx voucher holders, this can be disproportionately lead to renting in racially segregated, economically marginalized communities. How can vouchers be leveraged as a tool for community development in these neighborhoods?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would go back to the idea that voucher expansion can serve as kind of a stimulative effect on the housing supply, right? And whether you're place-basing or you're still using them as tenant-based, it allows for greater production of housing, whether it's tax credit financed housing or otherwise. And so I really see this as an opportunity to I'm not necessarily worried about rents going up because we have vouchers. What I'm excited about is bringing developers in communities that need development and using the vouchers as an opportunity to get this done. And so I teach an affordable housing seminar, and it's one of my favorite stories. These were kind of affordability warrior students, and they were running a tax credit model, and they came up to me and said, Greg, we have to charge higher rents because it doesn't work, because land and everything is expensive in Seattle, or we need a voucher, right? And so the idea is like the vouchers will help this production so much, and I think that's an underappreciated aspect of this, and that could help these neighborhoods and get investment there. We don't need to move everyone to affluent suburbs. We can invest in these neighborhoods, and the vouchers can be a key tool in doing that.
Yeah, I'll add on to that in just a little bit, right? And I think that's part of the issue that we've seen as kind of local municipalities have addressed housing issues, that there has been no focus on community building that's associated with that. It's been build more housing, and then the end result is that people are naturally, gravitate to one another, and that's just not the case. In terms of doing that as well, we also see that in a lot of these communities, it's not just that there's disadvantage, but there's constant disinvestment that goes along with their state. And we do know that a lot of neighborhoods just don't change as much. So if housing vouchers bring in a new kind of a new type of long-term subsidy to be implemented or invested in these particular neighborhoods, then it does give us the chance to think about people don't have to, as Greg said, as you said, that they don't have to move to wealthier neighborhoods, that this accompanied investment could go along with other types of tools and programs and policies at the local or regional level. And we know that neighborhoods, their kind of state changes overnight. One time, one day it's the worst neighborhood, and then within a few years it gentrifies like crazy. So they get ahead of the rhetoric or the discourse that's surrounding these neighborhoods needs to be in conjunction with the policy implementation and evaluation of these things. Anybody else before I ask another question? All right. One of the major challenges facing low-income renters is the increasing difficulty of moving to high opportunity cities, as we've talked about before, which often have very high housing costs. In light of this, how would a universal housing voucher program address voucher portability?
I would just say that, so the nice part right now, right, is you can port with your voucher to other jurisdictions. The problem becomes is that you're then subject to kind of the way they calculate rent limits. So insofar as something like small area fair market rents are adopted, right, aside from moving to an MSA where your voucher subsidy would change by virtue of it being calculated based on that local market, if you had something like a small area fair market rent, you might actually see that happen at a higher scale, right? So that doesn't account for moving costs, which can be clearly significant. And this is something Eva was talking about earlier on, right? Thinking about just not the cost of moving, right? Viewing places, but actually the move itself, the cost of the down payment, those are clearly concomitant things. But within the program itself, if you adopted a universal voucher program within also a small area from our kind of mindset, you can allow for people to port across jurisdictions, and the subsidy could kind of adjust accordingly to at least cover the kind of housing differentials in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, I think in terms of, before we go to the next question, I think part of that specific, right, is to think about how much do people actually move, and the numbers have just, lower income populations or renters are moving at typically higher rates than people who have more residential stability. And this gives a bigger question to think about. What was brought up in earlier panels, to think about the institutional capacity at the local level across these different municipalities, right? So, NYCHA, or New York City's housing authority, is the largest by far, but at the same time, you have all these other housing authorities across the country with different capacity levels, as we've seen them implement emergency rental assistance programs as well. So the kind of last question, or the next question, becomes like, how can housing vouchers be folded into and even encouraged to lead efforts to improve program experiences and organizations? And specifically, how can we address some of the differing levels of institutional capacity of housing authorities at the local level? And that's a stumper. That's a hard one. I'll start and everybody jump in. So I think part of it is that the even if we did have a universal housing voucher program, this is not the only type of housing assistance program, right? So depending on the city or your municipality that you're actually looking at, they could have other programs that they're spearheading or promoting just as much, right? Like public housing, scatter site properties, other types of housing assistance programs that actually function in those particular markets. And while even if we're pushing for a universal housing voucher program, we need to be very careful and to understand the contextual features of those local municipalities and the stock and land that they actually have available. Like the universal housing program in Atlanta is not the same as in Macon, Georgia. It's not going to be the same as in New York or LA or Philly or even Seattle. So like, while we can have a broad federal program, we need to have more nuance in it, so it can allow for more rural or other places outside of our big urban cities to function in a way that allows more people to utilize the program more efficiently and more effectively for the long term. Yeah.
And I would just add, this is kind of connects to the rent relief conversation early on, right? Which is that we've underfunded housing agencies for so long and just asked them to keep recycling the same money and the fixed overhead amount, right? And so what this does is it really increases the pie in a significant way, which creates more admin kind of overhead to actually do other things, more opportunities to create new programs and leverage stuff, more opportunities to kind of explore partnerships, right? In the first panel, they talk about partnerships with nonprofits, right? And other kind of organizations, and really acknowledge that. So it's not in any way saying making it universal creates all this kind of ripple and the whole world is wonderful, but it creates a lot more opportunity. We've been a field defined by constraints and functioning within that for so long. And so the idea of kind of expansion, which with the infrastructure bill and maybe Build Back Better, but then beyond that talks of a universal voucher, really create new opportunities. So it's critical to think about how we use that in new and innovative ways, how we invest in capacity of PHAs and other organizations, and how we kind of leverage those partnerships. And I'm kind of really excited about the idea that those can actually happen in a much more expanded way, which hopefully lead to a lot more opportunities on those fronts.
And I would just add and echo what Vincent said. And it's not even underfunded PHAs. There are well-funded PHAs, two in my backyard, who picked up the phone and called me when emergency housing vouchers were passed and said, oh no, what do we do? Right? We now have this flood of new vouchers. We are a fairly sophisticated public housing authority, but still this is a big challenge because there aren't necessarily abundant housing units just sitting out there. And so they had to work really hard to implement that. And that certainly wasn't an increase nearly as much as what universal vouchers would be, right? And so ultimately, we also need to think about that infrastructure and making sure that we invest in that critical housing authority infrastructure to ensure that this is successful. We can't just throw these on them and expect that good things will happen immediately. I don't think that's a fair request.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all. So I think we're on a page for two specific things. Is we do want a more equitable housing system overall, right? We do, and we would definitely promote a universal housing voucher program as one tool in the toolkit to address the housing needs of the people across this country. So thank you all for joining us today. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Raphael Bostic, who's the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, for closing remarks.
To say that, I hope that you have found today to be a very interesting and thought-provoking session. For me, when I heard about this, I was very excited because, our bank for a long time has taken on the notion of economic mobility and resilience as something that's really important and that will help us move ever closer to having an economy that works for everyone, which is one of our taglines in thinking about what effective policy and what institutional effectiveness looks like. I'll also say that for me, this personally is actually a very important conference and a very important subject because for a long time, I have been working in the housing space, as most of you know. Vincent, it's good to see you. And I will say that I have really come to a place of thinking about housing as something that everyone should have, but also we need to make sure that people are housed well. And there's so much evidence about the costs and the social costs of housing instability that programs like this are really important to help us make sure that people don't have to worry about where they're going to lay their head, so they can then in turn worry about how they're going to invest in themselves and make a positive change and a positive contribution to their local, regional, and indeed the macro economy. So this is really important. I hope that the discussions and the presentations today have helped you and helped everyone really think hard about ways that they might improve our housing system to get us to a better place. And, while this is happening in the context of a pandemic, I would just note, and I think it's important to just reemphasize, we had housing instability problems before the pandemic, and they were significant, and many of the people who spoke today have been spending a lot of their time thinking about what that looks like and how we might move forward. I spent the last several years here in this context, and when we think about precariousness, really trying to emphasize and think hard about how do you make long-term investments that create structural changes and how people experience the barriers to their productivity. And in this instance, I'm really hopeful that the discussions today and this conference can help inform how we can create an infrastructure that allows people to not have to worry about their housing. And that infrastructure needs to involve both emergency interventions, so things that what might happen in the context of a crisis like COVID, but also more fundamentally at a structural level, because the world can change and things happen to people all the time. And we want to make sure that one bad draw or one bad event doesn't lead to a significant shift away from the stability that we all need people to have. Now, I will tell you one thing I've really come to recently in my career is the idea that implementation matters a lot. And I heard a lot in this last session talking about how having resources is one thing, but how they're deployed and how they're invested to get to people is something totally different. And we need to make sure that as we think about the future and this a new housing state, we do it in a way that facilitates easy transfer of funds, easier manipulation of moving through systems, and ultimately get us to a place where people don't only have to worry about what happens to them and don't have to worry about, well, once something happens, can I navigate the landscape to get to a better place? So let me want to just close by saying this. The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta has had a real long history in this, and I'm really pleased that we were able to contribute to this conversation. I want to thank all of you for being a part of what I hope will lead to new avenues of research and ultimately get us to a housing market, a rental market, and an economy that works for everyone. So thank you for all your work, all your thinking on this, and I will now turn this over to our day's moderator.
Thank you very much, President Bostic. I'd also like to thank our presenters for sharing their time and expertise with us. At this time, please watch your screen. We are going to share a link to a survey, and we'd appreciate any feedback that you can provide about today's session. It will only take about 2 minutes to complete the survey. A recording of this session and the presenter slides will be made available on fedcommunities.org shortly after this presentation. To immediately rewatch this event, you can use this event site by logging on with the email you used to register. While on fedcommunities.org, please subscribe for updates about future events. We hope you'll join us for additional conversations about strategies to help promote economic growth and financial stability in communities across the country. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.